In the hour before the audience arrived at Carnegie Hall for George Carlin's performance, the hall was completely empty. Not quiet in the way of a building between events, not the ambient hum of a venue being prepared, the crew making their last checks, the front-of-house staff setting up for the evening's crowd. The hall was in the specific state that the largest performance spaces reach in the final period before the doors open. Technically ready, thoroughly cleaned, waiting. The seats were set. The stage was lit in its pre-show configuration. Every surface that was going to be seen by the audience was prepared to be seen. And in the middle of it, on the stage, alone, was George Carlin. He had asked for this time. He had made the request in the particular directness with which performers who understand what they need tend to make requests, for a period alone in the hall before the evening began. Not for rehearsal, not to run material or check sound levels or make any of the practical adjustments that require a performer to be in the space. Simply to be in it, alone, before the audience arrived. The people who were working with him that night understood the request without requiring explanation. It was not an unusual thing for a performer of his experience to want. The relationship between a performer and a large, unfamiliar room is a specific kind of relationship, and the hour before the doors open is the time when that relationship can be established on the performer's terms rather than the audience's. But what Carlin did in that hour, what he was actually doing when he stood alone on the Carnegie Hall stage in the silence of the empty room, was something he would return to in conversation for years afterward. Not in the way of a story with a clean resolution, not with the specific conclusion that makes an anecdote usable on a talk show. In the way of something that remained incompletely understood, something that he knew had mattered, but that he had not yet found the right form to describe. Carnegie Hall is not a room. It is a statement. And Carlin had been in enough rooms, in enough states of fullness and emptiness, to know the specific quality of what this particular space was saying in the hour before anyone arrived. What it was saying was this: you will perform here, or you will not. But this room existed before you arrived, has held the greatest performances in a century of music and art, and will exist long after this evening is over. What happens tonight is yours. The room itself is not. Carlin stood in this for an hour, and then the doors opened, and the people came in, and the performance that followed was different from what it would have been if he had not stood there. The specific quality of what Carlin did in that hour on the empty Carnegie Hall stage was not what an actor or a musician in a similar situation might do. An actor in a new theater walks the stage, finds its dimensions physically, learns the angles to the house from different positions. A musician tests the acoustics, plays passages, adjusts their understanding of how the sound travels in the room. These are practical processes, the professional's engagement with the specific technical requirements of a new performance space. Carlin's hour on the empty stage was not primarily practical. He walked a stage, yes. He stood at the microphone, yes. He spoke a few words into the empty hall, testing the sound, getting the specific quality of the room's acoustic response. These things happened. But the main work of that hour was something else. Something that performers who spend a significant amount of time in large rooms understand, and that is difficult to describe to people who haven't been there. The process of making peace with a room. A large, empty performance space has a specific quality of presence. 2,000 empty seats are not nothing. They are the expectation of 2,000 people, the particular weight of an audience that does not yet exist, but that is about to exist, whose arrival will transform the space from an empty room into something charged with the specific energy of people who have come to receive something. For some performers, this weight is primarily felt as pressure. The seats that will be filled are the seats that will be judging. The room that is empty now will be full of expectation when the show begins, and that expectation is what the performer will be measured against. Carlin had been in enough rooms over enough years to have a different relationship with this weight. He was not immune to the pressure of a large audience. No working comedian is, and the ones who claim to be are usually not telling the truth about what they feel before they walk out. But he had developed, through the specific process of decades of performing, a way of standing in the empty room that allowed him to make his peace with what it was going to become. The process was not complicated. He stood on the stage. He looked at the empty seats. He acknowledged, privately and without ceremony, that the room was what it was, that it had a history and a weight and a significance that existed entirely independently of him and of what he was going to do in it tonight. He did not try to master the room or claim it or diminish it. He simply stood in it and allowed it to be what it was. And then, having done this, he allowed something else to be equally true. That what he was going to do in this room tonight was also what it was. That the material he had built, the performance he had prepared, the specific thing he was going to give this audience was also real and present and sufficient. That the room's history and his work were not in competition. They could coexist. When the doors opened and the audience came in, Carlin was still on the stage, not performing, watching them take their seats, watching Carnegie Hall become what it became when it was full. The room he had made peace with in the empty hour was becoming the room he was going to perform in. And what happened in the performance that followed, the specific quality of what the audience received that night, had something to do with that hour. Carnegie Hall had been built in 1891 and had since become, in the specific way of certain cultural institutions, a place that meant something beyond its function as a performance venue. Performing there was not simply performing. It was being measured against the accumulated weight of what the room had held. The musicians, conductors, speakers, performers across more than a century of significant cultural events. This weight is a real thing. It is not a myth that performers create to give themselves a reason to be nervous. It is the specific quality of a space whose history is physically present in it, in the architecture, in the acoustics that have been tuned over 100 years of significant performances, in the cultural meaning that has been attached to the room by everything that has happened within it.
For a stand-up comedian, Carnegie Hall carried a particular kind of weight that was different from what it carried for a classical musician or an opera singer or a theater director. Those forms had long and established relationships with Carnegie Hall. Stand-up comedy did not. The room was not built for what Carlin was going to do in it. The tradition of the room was not the tradition of a man standing at a microphone and making observations about American culture. This was not incidental to Carlin's decision to perform there. It was part of what the performance meant. Stand-up comedy, in the specific form that Carlin had been building through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the long-form observational comedy that required the audience to follow an argument rather than simply receive jokes, was making a claim, by appearing at Carnegie Hall, about the kind of cultural seriousness that comedy was capable of. Carlin understood this. He was not naive about the symbolic weight of the venue, and he was not performing in it by accident. The choice of Carnegie Hall was itself a statement about what stand-up comedy was, about where it belonged in the landscape of American performance culture, about whether the form deserved the room. But understanding this intellectually, and standing alone on the Carnegie Hall stage in the hour before the doors open, are different things. The intellectual understanding arrives at the meaning of the room from outside. Standing alone on the stage arrives at it from inside. And what the inside of the empty Carnegie Hall communicates to a person standing alone on its stage is something that the intellectual understanding does not fully prepare you for. Carlin had been in the room for about 20 minutes when he understood what he had come to do, not what he had come to perform. He knew what he was going to perform. The material was built, the set was planned, the performance was ready in the sense that any performance is ready before it is actually given. What he understood in those 20 minutes was what he had come to establish. Before the audience arrived, before the performance began, before the room became the room of the audience rather than the room of the empty space, he had come to establish something about his relationship with this particular hall. And the thing he needed to establish was this: he was not afraid of it. The performance at Carnegie Hall that followed the empty hour was, by any account of it that survives, one of the better performances of that period of Carlin's career. Not the most technically precise. He had given technically precise performances in smaller rooms with more intimate atmospheres that were, in the specific mechanics of stand-up comedy, better constructed. Not the most celebrated. There were performances from that decade that were recorded and preserved and that became the documented standard of his work from that period. But there was a quality in the Carnegie Hall performance that people who were there described with a specific consistency. The performance was not trying to fill the room. It was not the performance of a comedian attempting to establish a presence commensurate with the size and significance of the venue. It was the performance of a man who had already made his peace with the room and was now simply doing the work. This is a distinction that is sometimes visible in live performance and sometimes not. Most of the time, the size of the room does not significantly affect the character of the work. The performer adjusts, professionally and unconsciously, to the scale of the space they are in. But occasionally, with performers who have developed a very specific relationship with the room's energy, the adjustment is not just technical, but qualitative. Something in the performance reflects the performer's relationship with the space. Carlin's Carnegie Hall performance reflected his hour on the empty stage. The specific quality of ease, not the ease of a performer who has stopped caring, but the ease of a performer who has settled their relationship with the room before the audience arrived, and can therefore give the audience the work rather than the performance of someone trying to rise to the occasion. He said, in various interviews over the years after that night, that the empty room before a performance was the most important room. Not the room during the performance. That room was the audience's room, was the conversation between the material and the people receiving it, and could not be controlled or managed by the performer in any meaningful way. The empty room was the performer's room. The hour before the audience arrived was the hour that belonged to the performance rather than to the audience. He never explained exactly what he did in that hour. He described it in general terms, standing on the stage, looking at the seats, speaking into the empty hall. He did not articulate the specific private process that the hour contained, and this was, perhaps, appropriate. The private preparation before a performance is the part of the work that belongs to the performer rather than to the account of the performance. But what the Carnegie Hall audience received that night, the specific quality of a performer who was not trying to be adequate to a significant room because he had already settled that question in the hour when nobody was watching, was something they could feel without being able to name it. The hall had 100 years of significant performances behind it. Carlin had 30 years of developing a relationship with his material and with the rooms where he gave it. In the hour before the audience arrived, those two things had met on the empty stage. And when the show began, what the room held was the result of that meeting. The seats filled, the lights changed. He walked out to the microphone. The room that had been his in the empty hour became the room of 2,000 people. But the hour had already happened. The piece had already been made, and the performance that followed knew this. The audience could feel it. They would not have been able to say why, but they could feel it.